Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping house or the peaceful quiet of a forest at dawn, but the terrible, absolute silence that arrives when something fundamental has broken. On the morning of March 15, 2247, every listening station humanity had scattered across the solar system and beyond went dead. The constant background chatter of the universe, the pulsar rhythms, the stellar winds, the electromagnetic whispers of distant civilizations that humanity had decoded over the past century, all of it stopped at once, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Dr. Sarah Chen was the first to notice. She sat in the observation deck of the Armstrong relay station, suspended in the gravitational sweet spot between Mars and Jupiter, watching her screens turn from a cacophony of data into flat, empty lines. For 17 years, she had monitored the communications array, the vast network that kept humanity connected to its scattered colonies and listening posts. She had weathered solar storms, equipment failures, and the occasional cosmic ray shower that scrambled her instruments. But this was different. This was everything going quiet at once. She ran the diagnostics 3 times before accepting what she was seeing. The equipment was fine. The universe had simply stopped talking. Her hands trembled as she opened the emergency channel to Earth Command, and, for the first time in her career, she struggled to find her voice. What do you say when the stars themselves have gone silent? How do you report the death of cosmic conversation? Earth Command took her seriously because they had no choice. Within hours, every observatory, every satellite, every deep space monitoring station confirmed the same impossible thing. The universe had withdrawn into itself, and humanity was alone in a way it had never been before. The news spread across the colonies like a virus, generating panic on Mars, prayer on the generation ships, and grim speculation on Europa. Humanity had spent 2 centuries learning to listen to the cosmos. Now the cosmos had stopped listening back. But Sarah knew something the others didn't. In those final moments before the silence fell, she had caught something on her instruments. A pulse. No, not a pulse, a scream. A transmission so powerful it had overwhelmed her receivers, coming from the direction of Sol, from Earth itself. She had archived it automatically, but, in the chaos of the silence, she hadn't had time to analyze it. Now, alone in her quarters while the rest of the station descended into controlled chaos, she pulled up the data. What she found made her blood run cold. The transmission wasn't random noise or some natural phenomenon. It was structured, deliberate, and utterly terrifying in its implications. Someone on Earth had broadcast something so powerful, so fundamentally disruptive, that it had rippled across spacetime itself. And, embedded in that transmission was a message, repeating on every frequency, in every language humanity had ever spoken and, several it hadn't, we are no longer prey. The path to that moment had begun 43 years earlier, in the slums of New Jakarta, in the crumbling remains of what had once been Indonesia. Kale Theron was born into a world already dying, a world that had given up on itself long before his first breath. His mother died bringing him into a life not worth living. His father disappeared into the labor camps when Kale was 5, swept up in one of the endless resource wars that plagued the late 22nd century. He grew up in the spaces between, an orphan among millions, fighting for scraps in the ruins of human civilization. The Earth of 2204 was not the Earth of hope and exploration that the history books remembered. It was a planet ravaged by climate catastrophe, choked by pollution, and divided among corporate empires that treated human beings as disposable resources. The colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter were gleaming testaments to human ingenuity, yes, but they were built on the broken backs of Earth's billions. The best and brightest left. The strongest and most ambitious fled to the stars. What remained were the discarded, the forgotten, those deemed too weak or too worthless to deserve a place in humanity's glorious future. Kale learned early that weakness was not just a disadvantage, it was a death sentence. He learned it when the older boys beat him for the nutrient paste that served as his weekly ration. He learned it when he watched a girl his age die of a treatable infection because the medical stations only served those who could pay. He learned it when he was forced into the tunnels beneath the city, crawling through toxic waste to salvage circuit boards that corporate drones would buy for pennies. Every day was a lesson in powerlessness, every night a reminder that the universe did not care if he lived or died. But Kale had something the others didn't. Not strength, he was small for his age, thin as wire, with bones that showed through his skin. Not intelligence, the schools had closed years before he was old enough to attend them. What he had was hatred. Pure, distilled, absolutely focused hatred for his own weakness. He hated the way he flinched when the older boys approached. He hated the tears that came when he was hungry. He hated the part of him that wanted to give up, to lie down in the toxic mud and stop fighting. That hatred became his fuel, his purpose, the only thing that kept him crawling forward when everything else said to stop. He began with small victories. He learned to hide his rations where no one could find them. He learned which corporate drones would pay more for salvage and how to negotiate without showing fear. He learned to read by studying the discarded data screens he found in the tunnels, teaching himself through sheer stubborn repetition. Each tiny triumph was a brick laid in the wall he was building against the world. Each moment he refused to surrender was a small death of his weaker self. By the time he was 12, Cale had survived longer than most in the slums. That alone was an achievement. But survival wasn't enough anymore. He had discovered something in the abandoned corporate databases he accessed through salvaged equipment, information. The corporations that ruled Earth from their orbital platforms, the colonial governments that looked down on the homeworld with disgust, they all believed that Earth's population was controllable because they were ignorant. Keep them desperate, keep them stupid, and they would never question the system that ground them to dust. Cale began to learn everything he could. He taught himself programming from corporate training modules never meant for eyes like his. He studied physics from educational materials intended for colonial children. He absorbed history, mathematics, engineering, every scrap of knowledge he could steal from the data networks. It was dangerous work. The corporate AI monitors were always watching, always hunting for unauthorized access. Getting caught meant immediate termination, not arrest. The corporations didn't waste resources on trials for people like him. But, with each day, he felt the weak version of himself dying a little more. The boy who had been afraid of the dark, terrified of pain, desperate for approval, that boy was being methodically destroyed, replaced by something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. Cale was teaching himself not just knowledge but discipline. He learned to control his fear, to suppress his doubts, to function on minimal sleep and less food. He was forging himself into a weapon, though he didn't yet know what he would point that weapon at. The turning point came when he was 16. He had broken into a corporate data cache, looking for information he could sell to the underground markets. Instead, he found something else, classified files from the First Contact War. Humanity's official history said that the war had been defensive, that the alien collective known as the Harbingers had attacked without provocation and that humanity had barely survived. The files told a different story. Humanity had fired first, destroying a Harbinger research vessel because corporate analysts decided its technology was too valuable to negotiate for. The war that followed, the war that killed 3 billion people and left Earth a wasteland, had started because of human greed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came after. The Harbingers had sued for peace, had offered to help repair the damage, had extended every possible gesture of reconciliation. Humanity's response, directed by the corporate councils, had been to accept the peace publicly while secretly working to develop weapons that could strike at the Harbingers' home systems. The plan had failed. The Harbingers' quantum monitoring systems had detected the preparations, and they had responded not with violence but with something far more devastating. They had cut Earth off. No contact, no trade, no technology transfer. Earth was quarantined, left to rot in its own waste while the colonies flourished with Harbinger support. Cale read the files 3 times, unable to process what they meant. Everything he had been taught, every assumption he had made about the nature of the universe, was built on lies. Earth wasn't suffering because of alien aggression or natural disaster. Earth was suffering because the people in power had chosen to sacrifice it for their own advantage. The corporations that ruled from orbit had deliberately kept Earth weak, divided, and desperate because that made it easier to exploit. The rage that filled him then was different from the hatred he had cultivated against his own weakness. This was cold, calculating fury directed outward. He understood, with perfect clarity, that the system would never change on its own. The corporations would never suddenly develop compassion. The colonial governments would never decide to help their homeworld. If Earth was going to be saved, if humanity's billions of discarded children were going to have any chance at dignity, someone would have to force the change. But one person, even one as determined as Kale had become, couldn't fight corporate empires and interstellar governments. He would need allies. More than that, he would need to transform himself completely, to destroy every last trace of the weak, powerless child he had been. He would need to become something unprecedented, something the universe had never seen before. He started by going underground in ways the corporations couldn't track. He used his programming skills to create new identities, spreading versions of himself across the data networks like ghosts. He reached out to others like him, the forgotten and the discarded, those who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. He found engineers who remembered when they had built things that mattered, scientists who had been discarded when they got sick, soldiers from the corporate wars who had been thrown away when they were no longer useful. One by one, he brought them together, not with promises of revenge but with a simple question: are you ready to stop being weak? The movement that grew from those conversations had no name at first. It was just people helping each other survive, sharing resources, protecting the vulnerable. But Kale was building towards something larger. He had learned from his study of history that every successful revolution required three things: a clear enemy, a compelling vision, and the willingness to pay any price for victory. He had the enemy, the corporate oligarchy that had turned Earth into a sacrifice zone. He had the vision, a humanity united, powerful, refusing to be prey for anyone. What he needed now was the willingness to pay the price. That price became clear when he was 23. The movement had grown beyond what he could have imagined, spreading through Earth's slums and factory zones like wildfire. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of desperate people finding purpose and power in collective action. The corporations noticed, of course. Their initial response was predictable: targeted strikes against the movement's visible leaders, arrests and disappearances designed to terrorize the rest into submission. Kale watched a dozen people he had recruited personally get dragged away by corporate security forces. He watched the videos of their interrogations, their torture, their eventual executions. The old Kale, the weak boy from the slums, would have broken under the guilt. Would have turned himself in to stop the suffering. That version of himself was long dead, and the man who remained understood that those deaths were not failures, they were investments. Each martyr created 100 new recruits. Each act of corporate brutality stripped away another layer of the population's acceptance of the system. He began to orchestrate more direct confrontations, pushing the corporations to respond with increasing violence. Food riots that he knew would be suppressed with lethal force. Strikes in critical manufacturing sectors that would trigger automated security responses. It was brutal mathematics, trading lives for momentum, and Kale executed it with perfect coldness. He had destroyed the part of himself that felt guilt over necessary sacrifices. He had become a man who could calculate the exact number of deaths required to spark a global uprising and sleep soundly afterward. The corporations made their final mistake when they decided to make an example of New Jakarta. The orbital platforms positioned their weapons, massive railgun arrays designed to drop tungsten rods from space with the force of nuclear weapons. The plan was to obliterate the slum where Kale had been born, killing millions to terrorize billions. It was exactly what Kale had been waiting for. In the 3 days before the strike, he evacuated everyone he could, using the movement's networks to spread people throughout the city's tunnel systems. Then, he hacked the corporate communications networks and broadcast every detail of the planned attack to every screen on Earth. The world watched as the corporations prepared to commit genocide for the crime of demanding dignity. And, when the strike came, when the tungsten rods fell and turned 30 square kilometers of slum into a crater that glowed with residual heat, Kale made sure everyone saw the aftermath. The millions who had lived there, now vaporized. The thousands more dying from the shockwave and debris. The corporate spokespeople explaining calmly why it had been necessary to maintain order. That was the moment the revolution truly began. Not with hope or inspiration, but with absolute rage. Across Earth, billions of people who had accepted their suffering as inevitable suddenly understood that the system didn't just exploit them, it would kill them without hesitation if they stepped out of line. The uprising that followed made every previous revolution in human history look like a minor dispute. Factory workers seized control of manufacturing plants. Engineers turned automated systems against their corporate masters. Soldiers who had been fighting for corporate armies turned their weapons on their commanders. Kale orchestrated it all from a hidden bunker beneath the ruins of Shanghai, coordinating through quantum encrypted networks, directing forces he had spent years building. He had become a ghost in the machine, everywhere and nowhere, impossible to track or stop. The corporations tried, of course. They sent kill teams and viral AI programs and even orbital strikes against suspected locations. But Kale had learned from the new Jakarta massacre. He had already destroyed the part of himself that needed a fixed location, a safe place, a home. He moved constantly, trusted no one completely, and accepted that he would probably die before seeing his work completed. The war lasted 7 years. 7 years of brutal urban combat, of orbital bombardments met with hacked defense systems, of corporations discovering that their automated armies could be turned against them by people who had nothing left to lose. Earth became a charnel house, a planet-wide battlefield where the old order fought desperately to maintain control against a population that had finally learned to fight back. The colonies watched in horror, the other species of the galaxy maintained their boycott, and Kale continued to press forward, accepting casualties that would have broken any conventional military force. He won not through superior firepower but through superior willingness to sacrifice. The corporations could build more weapons, deploy more security forces, drop more tungsten rods from orbit. But they couldn't match the dedication of people who had decided that death was preferable to continued submission. For every person Kale's forces lost, 2 more joined the fight. The corporations were fighting to maintain profit margins. Earth's billions were fighting for the right to be treated as human beings. The end came not with a surrender but with a retreat. The corporate councils, seeing their assets on Earth become liabilities, made the cold calculation that the planet wasn't worth the resources being spent to control it. They withdrew to their orbital platforms and the colonies, taking their technology and wealth and leaving Earth to govern itself. It should have been a moment of triumph. Humanity had won its freedom, had broken the chains that bound it. Instead, Kale looked at the ruins of civilization and understood that the real work was just beginning. Earth was free, yes, but it was also devastated. The war had killed another billion people. The industrial infrastructure was shattered. The climate was worse than ever, and the rest of humanity wanted nothing to do with a planet that had descended into chaos. The colonies refused aid, afraid that Earth's violence would spread to them. The alien species of the galaxy maintained their quarantine, remembering all too well what happened when humans felt threatened. Kale was 30 years old and looked 50. The stress of the war, the minimal food and sleep, the constant movement and conflict had aged him in ways that went deeper than physical appearance. He gathered what remained of the movement's leadership in the ruins of Geneva, in what had once been the United Nations headquarters. There were perhaps 200 of them, men and women who had given everything to the revolution, who had destroyed their own weak selves in the fires of war. He stood before them and spoke with absolute honesty. We won the war, but we're losing the peace. Earth is free, but we're alone and dying. The colonies won't help us. The aliens won't acknowledge us. We can rebuild with what we have, slowly, over generations. We can accept that we're second-class citizens in a universe that views us as dangerous primitives. Or we can do something unprecedented. They asked what he meant, and Kale told them about a project he had been developing in secret for the past 3 years. During the war, his forces had captured several corporate research facilities working on theoretical physics. The scientists there had been exploring something called quantum resonance weaponry technology that could affect spacetime itself, creating ripples that would propagate across the galaxy at speeds that made light look motionless. The corporations had been trying to develop it as the ultimate weapon against the Harbingers, a way to strike at their home systems before they could respond. Kale proposed something different. He wanted to build a transmission system using the quantum resonance technology, something that could broadcast across the entire galaxy simultaneously. But, instead of a weapon, it would be a declaration. A message that would force every spacefaring civilization to acknowledge Earth's existence and strength. A demonstration that humanity was not prey, not victims, not weak creatures to be pitted or feared. It was insane, potentially catastrophic, and absolutely necessary. The debate that followed lasted 3 days. Many argued that it was too dangerous, that it would provoke the very retaliation they had been trying to avoid. Others said they didn't have the resources, that Earth was too damaged to support such a massive project. Cale listened to every objection and, then, addressed them systematically. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, it might provoke retaliation. But, the alternative was accepting permanent weakness, and he hadn't spent 15 years destroying his weak self only to accept weakness for his species. The vote was close, but it passed. They would build the resonance array, and they would use it to announce to the universe that Earth was no longer a victim of circumstance. The project took 13 more years, 13 years of scavenging technology from corporate ruins, reverse engineering alien devices captured during the First Contact War, and pushing theoretical physics into realms it had never explored. Cale drove them forward with the same ruthless focus he had used during the Revolution. Every setback was analyzed and overcome. Every resource was maximized. Every person involved understood that failure meant the permanent subjugation of their species. Sarah Chen had been one of those people once, before she accepted a position on the Armstrong relay station. She had been a physicist working on the resonance array, recruited when she was fresh out of one of Earth's reconstructed universities. She had believed in the project initially, had worked 18-hour days alongside engineers and scientists who spoke of changing humanity's place in the cosmos. But, as the array neared completion, she had begun to have doubts. The power levels required were astronomical. The potential side effects were barely understood. When she raised concerns, Cale himself had met with her. She remembered that conversation in perfect detail, even now, decades later. Cale had listened to her concerns without interrupting, had acknowledged that she might be right about the risks. Then, he had asked her a simple question: if you were certain that humanity would remain enslaved, exploited, and eventually exterminated unless we took this risk, would you still refuse to act? She hadn't had an answer then. She didn't have one now, watching the data from that final transmission scroll across her screens. Cale had activated the array, and the results were even more dramatic than the most optimistic projections. The quantum resonance had propagated across the galaxy in microseconds, touching every star system, every inhabited world, every ship traveling between the stars. And, embedded in that resonance was Cale's message, translated by alien AI into every known language in the galaxy. The message was not diplomatic. It was not conciliatory or hopeful or designed to make friends. It was a declaration of sovereignty backed by the demonstrated ability to touch every corner of galactic civilization simultaneously. This is Earth. We have been ignored, exploited, and quarantined. We have been treated as primitives too dangerous to contact and too weak to defend ourselves. Those days are over. We are no longer prey. We will not be dismissed. We will not be victimized. Any species that wishes to engage with us will do so as equals, or they will not engage with us at all. This transmission demonstrates our ability to reach any point in the galaxy. Consider carefully what else we might be able to reach. The silence that followed was not the silence of awe or respect. It was the silence of an entire galaxy holding its breath, trying to process what had just happened. Humanity, the quarantined primitives, the species that had started the First Contact War through greed and stupidity, had just announced itself as a power that could touch civilizations thousands of light years away. The implications were staggering. If Earth could send messages through quantum resonance, what else could it send? Weapons? Surveillance? The uncertainty was as powerful as any fleet. Sarah watched the data streams, waiting for the response she knew would come. The galaxy couldn't stay silent forever. Already, her instruments were detecting activity, quantum fluctuations that suggested other civilizations were attempting to respond, to communicate, to understand what had happened. But, the resonance Cale had triggered had done something to the normal communications infrastructure. It had created a kind of interference pattern, a quantum echo that was drowning out conventional signals. The galaxy was trying to speak, but Earth's message had made it temporarily impossible for anyone else to be heard. It was, she realized, the ultimate power play. Kale hadn't just announced Earth's presence, he had seized control of galactic communications, if only for a brief time. Every civilization that wanted to be heard again would have to engage with Earth, to negotiate for the silence to end. He had turned humanity's isolation into leverage, their weakness into strength. On Earth, in a bunker beneath New Geneva, Kale Theron watched the same data streams and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He was 73 years old now, his body failing in a dozen different ways from decades of stress and deprivation. The doctors said he had perhaps 6 months left, maybe less. It didn't matter. He had accomplished what he set out to do so many years ago in the slums of Jakarta. He had destroyed his weak self so completely that nothing of that frightened child remained. And, in doing so, he had destroyed humanity's weakness as well. The younger members of his staff were terrified, asking what they should do when the aliens responded, whether Earth could survive retaliation from advanced civilizations that could cross star systems. Kale understood their fear. They had grown up during the Reconstruction, had learned to hope for peace and integration into galactic society. They didn't understand what he had learned in the slums: the universe doesn't respect the weak. It tolerates them at best, exploits them more commonly, and exterminates them when convenient. He called together his closest advisors, the ones who had been with him since the revolution. They'll try to negotiate first, he told them. The advanced civilizations, the ones that style themselves as peaceful and enlightened, they'll send diplomatic overtures. They'll offer trade, technology, integration into galactic society if we'll just shut down the array and return to being quiet and submissive. And if we refuse, one of them asked. Then, they'll threaten. Economic sanctions first, military action if that doesn't work. They'll try to isolate us again, to make an example of us to any other species that might get ideas about challenging the established order. Kale's smile was thin and cold. Let them try. We've been isolated for a century. We've been sanctioned and quarantined and left to die. We survived it all and came back stronger. What can they threaten us with that we haven't already endured? But there was another possibility, one he didn't mention to the others. The possibility that some civilization, somewhere, would decide that Earth had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That humanity had demonstrated too much capability too quickly, had shown itself to be fundamentally dangerous to galactic stability. Those civilizations wouldn't negotiate or threaten. They would simply act, sending weapons traveling at relativistic speeds to sterilize Earth before humanity could spread further. Kale had planned for that too. The resonance array wasn't just a communications device. The same technology that could send messages through quantum space could detect incoming threats before conventional sensors. Earth wouldn't have much warning if someone decided on extermination, but it would have some. And, in the years spent building the array, other projects had progressed in parallel. Defense systems based on captured alien technology. Weapons that the corporations had been developing before their fall. Not enough to win a war against a galactic coalition, but enough to make victory expensive. The first response came 3 days after the silence fell. Not from the Harbingers or any of the other major civilizations, but from a species called the Keshri, an aquatic race that had been trading with human colonies for decades. Their message was brief and, to the point: we acknowledge Earth's demonstration. We propose formal diplomatic relations. Please cease the resonance interference so normal communications can resume. Kale had Sarah send a response equally brief: diplomatic relations will be established when Earth is recognized as a sovereign power with full rights and protections under galactic law. Until then, the array remains active. The Keshri's second message took longer, suggesting they were consulting with other civilizations. When it came, it was more detailed, outlining a process for bringing Earth into what they called provisional membership in the galactic community. There would be observers, restrictions on certain technologies, requirements for demonstrating peaceful intent. It was the kind of offer that would have seemed generous a century ago. Now it read like an insult. Kale had the response prepared before the message finished transmitting. Earth does not accept provisional status. Earth does not require observation or restriction. Earth offers this, full recognition as a sovereign power, or continued silence. You have 72 hours to decide. The Keshri didn't respond. Instead, over the next 24 hours, Sarah's instruments detected a flurry of quantum communications between the major civilizations. They were meeting, debating, trying to decide how to handle a species that refused to accept the subordinate position that had been assigned to it. The galaxy had operated for millennia on certain assumptions about power and hierarchy. Humanity was threatening those assumptions simply by refusing to acknowledge them. 60 hours into the deadline, a new message arrived. This one came from the Collective Council, the loosest thing the galaxy had to a governing body. It consisted of representatives from 200 species, including the Harbingers. The message was formal, diplomatic, and significant. The Collective Council recognizes Earth as a sovereign power within the galactic community, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. We request the cessation of quantum resonance interference and the beginning of formal diplomatic relations. It was everything Kale had demanded. Full recognition, no conditions, no provisional status. In 73 hours, he had accomplished what centuries of negotiation had failed to achieve. Earth was no longer the quarantine embarrassment, the dangerous primitives to be avoided. It was a recognized power, able to engage with the galaxy as an equal. Sarah expected Kale to shut down the array, to accept victory and begin the process of integration. Instead, he kept it running. When she asked why, he looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, lived too long beyond what any human should endure. Because recognition means nothing without respect, and respect only comes from demonstrated capability. The array stays active for one more week. Let them see that we can maintain this, that it's not a desperate gambit but a sustainable reality. Then, we'll talk about shutting it down. That week was the longest of Sarah's life. Every day, she expected to detect incoming weapons, to see the first signs of a galactic strike against Earth. The major civilizations had accepted humanity's demands, but there were others, smaller, more aggressive species that might see an opportunity to make a name for themselves by bringing the upstart humans down. Kale had assigned teams to monitor every approach vector, every possible threat, and Sarah watched them work with a combination of admiration and terror. But no attack came. Instead, something unexpected happened. Other species began to respond not with fear or anger, but with curiosity. Messages arrived from civilizations that had been on the periphery of galactic society, asking how Earth had developed the quantum resonance technology. Younger species, ones that had also been given provisional status and restricted access to advanced technology, wanted to know how humanity had bypassed those restrictions. What Kale had intended as a demonstration of strength was becoming something else, a beacon for every species that had felt constrained by the galactic hierarchy. Kale saw it before anyone else did. "We're not just changing Earth's position," he said during a meeting with his staff. "We're changing the entire structure. Every species that's been told they're too primitive, too dangerous, too unreliable, they're watching us and realizing they don't have to accept those judgments." One of his advisors, a former corporate scientist named Dr. James Morrison, pointed out the danger. If we inspire too many revolutions, the established powers might decide we're too destabilizing to be allowed to exist. Kale's response was immediate: then, they'll learn the same lesson we had to learn. You can't maintain control through fear and restriction forever. Eventually, someone refuses to accept it, and then, the whole structure is at risk. We're not trying to inspire revolution. We're simply refusing to be weak. If that inspires others, that's the Collective Council's problem, not ours. On the seventh day, Kale ordered the array shut down. The quantum interference faded, and normal communications resumed across the galaxy. The silence ended, but it was replaced by something unprecedented: conversation. Within hours, Earth was receiving thousands of messages from species across the galaxy. Trade offers, technology exchanges, requests for diplomatic meetings, and threats from a handful of more aggressive civilizations that Kale had expected and planned for. Earth's position in the galaxy transformed overnight. The colonies that had refused to help during the reconstruction suddenly wanted to renew their connections with the homeworld. The harbingers, who had maintained their boycott for a century, sent a delegation requesting formal peace talks. Even the corporations that had fled to the orbital platforms began negotiating for the right to return, offering technology and resources in exchange for access to Earth's markets. Kale negotiated with all of them from a position of strength he had built deliberately, methodically, through decades of sacrifice. Earth would trade, yes, but only as an equal. The colonies would be welcomed back, but not as overlords, as partners in a unified humanity. The harbingers would have their peace talks, but Earth would not apologize for defending itself or for breaking free from subjugation. Every conversation, every agreement, every treaty was built on a foundation of demonstrated capability and absolute refusal to accept weakness. He lived long enough to see the first Harbinger delegation arrive on Earth, long enough to shake the appendage of the being that represented the species humanity had once fought. The Harbinger representative spoke through a translator, expressing admiration for humanity's resilience and asking what Earth wanted from galactic society. Kale's answer was simple: we want what everyone wants. To be treated with dignity. To have our sovereignty respected. To be judged by our actions, not by assumptions about our nature. We won't be anyone's prey, but we won't be anyone's predator either. We're here, we're powerful enough to defend ourselves, and we're ready to be part of something larger than ourselves, but only as equals. He died 3 weeks later, his body finally giving out after decades of abuse. The news of his death spread across Earth and the colonies, generating responses that ranged from grief to relief to cold satisfaction from those who had opposed him. But even his enemies couldn't deny what he had accomplished. In one lifetime, he had transformed humanity from a scattered, subjugated species into a recognized galactic power. He had done it through absolute determination, ruthless strategy, and the complete destruction of every weakness within himself. Sarah attended his funeral in New Geneva, standing among thousands who had gathered to honor the man who had changed everything. The eulogies spoke of his vision, his courage, his unwavering commitment to Earth's freedom. But Sarah kept thinking about their last conversation, 3 days before he died. She had asked him if it had been worth it, the sacrifices, the casualties, the decades of struggle. Kale had looked at her with eyes that had long since stopped showing emotion. Worth is the wrong question. It was necessary. I was a weak child in a weak species living in a universe that doesn't tolerate weakness. I could either destroy that weakness or be destroyed by it. I chose destruction, and I never stopped choosing it. Every day, every decision, every sacrifice, they were all about becoming something that couldn't be destroyed by others because I had already destroyed everything in myself that could be vulnerable. But what did that cost you? Sarah had pressed. What did you lose in the process of destroying your weak self? Everything that would have made me a good man in peaceful times, Kale admitted. Compassion, mercy, the ability to accept compromise or half measures. I lost the capacity for normal happiness, for trust, for love. I became a weapon pointed at the universe's throat, and weapons don't get to be human in the ways that matter. Do you regret it? The pause had been long enough that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, regret is for people who had choices. I never had the luxury of choice. I was either going to be destroyed or become strong enough to survive. Everything else was just details. Now, watching them lower his body into the ground beneath a sky that was finally starting to clear after centuries of pollution, Sarah understood that Kale Theron had been both hero and monster, visionary and tyrant, savior and destroyer. He had destroyed his weak self so completely that nothing remained but purpose and will. And, in doing so, he had dragged humanity from the edge of extinction to a position of respect and powering galactic society. The question that haunted her, that would haunt humanity for generations to come, was whether the transformation had been worth the cost. How many people had died in the revolution? How many lives had been sacrificed to build the array? How much of humanity's soul had been sold to purchase its sovereignty? And, most troubling of all, had Kale destroyed only his own weakness, or had he destroyed something essential in the human spirit itself? The galaxy moved on, as it always did. Earth established trade relations with dozens of species, signed treaties and agreements, began the slow process of rejoining the larger community it had been exiled from. The colonies integrated with the homeworld, creating a unified human government that could speak with one voice to the stars. The technology that had seemed so far out of reach during the corporate era began flowing to Earth, accelerating reconstruction and recovery. But there were complications, consequences that Kale had foreseen but never spoke about publicly. The resonance array had demonstrated capabilities that made many species nervous. Formal recognition was one thing, trust was something else entirely. Several civilizations began developing countermeasures to quantum resonance technology, ways to shield their communications and detect incoming interference. Arms races were beginning, prompted by humanity's demonstration of power. More troubling were the ideological ripples spreading across the galaxy. Just as Kale had predicted, other species began questioning the hierarchies that had governed galactic society for millennia. Why should the collective council, dominated by a handful of ancient civilizations, get to decide which species were ready?